Elon Musk has commented on this. Odds that we aren't in a simulation are billions to one.
We have a special guest today, Dr. Richard Mundrell, who has a PhD in philosophy since 1992. He's been teaching philosophy since 1985. He's a teacher of mine. I studied logic under him. I studied philosophy of mind under him. I really respect this gentleman. And he today brings us a variety of topics. We didn't get a chance to go too deeply into any specific topic, but we touched on a whole plethora of topics, from religion, from physics, from information theory, computer science, and philosophy, of course. Now, the idea was to discuss the simulation hypothesis as presented by David Chalmers based on the work of Nick Bostrom. However, we didn't get a chance to go too deeply into it. In case you're interested in a more deeper conversation, I would like you to reach out to me so I can reach out to Dr. Mundrell and we can dig deeper into one of these topics. However, today's conversation is quite interesting because it is quite broad and will appeal to a large variety of different people that are interested in some of these topics that are very relevant to our times. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the conversation with Dr. Richard Mundrell.
Hello, everybody. Much as we have much to learn as a people, we are still kind of hopefully going in the right direction in terms of if we were to take the evolution of the species as a good in our assumption. So, so I'm actually very curious to hear your thoughts on all this and much more.
Well, what I'd say about that is that, of course, what we're seeing in respect to the Zoom example,
right?
We were using technology to overcome a problem which to a large extent had been a product of technology. So, the trouble with the modern world is that there are a lot of people around and we're constantly moving around with jet travel. So viruses move very quickly globally. We saw that with the COVID pandemic. And we had known that was a danger for many years. So scientists had been warning us about that. So in the final analysis, it seems that, COVID was to a certain extent, a product of our modern technological lifestyle. And yet we were able to develop at least some technological responses to that. And that's the big question, I think the larger existential issues facing us, which many people quite rightly point out that, the technology is the root problem. Is more technology the answer? And, we have to worry that we are using way too much of the world's resources, and that the lifestyle that we have is in jeopardy. Aside from the fact that many people around the world have never had the opportunity to share in the kind of lifestyle that we have in the West. So, okay, so what needs to be done here? Do we think about, or do we have to go back to a pre-modern lifestyle, or is more technology the answer? And I don't have an answer to that one.
So you're saying that human beings have created external entities to help them in their survival goals, or I don't know how we would define technology. Actually, I shouldn't assume that, but humans, us, as people, we are, both benefiting from these technologies, and we are also they're hurting us, they're harming us in ways, and it seems like there's some kind of feedback loop where it's getting wider and wider, where it's the technology is more and more dangerous, right? For instance, nuclear technology, but that's just one instance. But don't you think it's just how we probably with fire, we must have fucked so much up when we first discovered it, we must have burned ourselves, we must have burned the world. And there's evidence to show that humans burnt out entire forests, much more social upheaval, environmental upheaval that we've ever achieved. We did that like a long, long time ago, right? Like and I think you're right that maybe that was also it's like a new thing is coming from reality, and an extra layer of complexity is forming on top of something, right? Or continuously. And I was just kind of going back to the last thing that you were teaching as well was, like you were talking about. So how can you guide me through, like, how did you get to Reality Plus? Because last time I met you, you were the conversation I had with you was about from Hoffman's perspective, right? And yeah. So can you shed light a little bit more on this problem from, like, how do you see it? Like, is it just inevitable that, species have technologies, or is it also that species can grow to heights of self-awareness where they can maybe reflect and then, because I'm thinking, like, this is making me, because when you ask about, you don't know the answer, and I'm like, I don't know the answer either. I just wondering, like, what do you think about, like, how should we then maybe become more internal? Like, some people have pointed out, like, internal technologies, like, like meditation and things like that. Like,
yeah. Well, this is the big question, and I've been reading lately critiques of modernity. And what I took away from that is this issue, which I think we need to think about, is that our modern advanced capitalist technological lifestyle enables us to live without thinking about the consequences of what we're doing, even if we think we're being environmentally responsible. And an example of that would be sewage treatment and disposal. So, we're quite happy to have sewage treatment facilities because we don't need to think about what happens after we flush the toilet, right? But, there are many places in the world where human excrement is used as fertilizer. And so it's something of value. So you're immediately connected with the circle of life, right?
So the disconnect between, like, just, that's so true, man. Like, the Chinese have a saying that they would, like, people would come to their house and, like, they would the more they would, like, use the washroom, the happier they would, because it was set up so that, like, the human excrement was definitely saved, and the family left, and they're like, oh, these people, and they send us a blessing. Like, it's a more sincere and honest interpretation of the way of things. It's not as diluted as to one's own, like, connections with all that's around us, and all that we are, and not just the desirable details, but in the undesirable details.
Yeah, and this is something that many of us in the West, this is a disgusting subject for us. And we'd find, being in that situation, being invited to a Chinese household where you are encouraged to share. Here's a bucket. Here's a bucket. We'll pick it up in the morning. That kind of thing, which would be very different. We would find that embarrassing, I would think, as well as unpleasant. But there are many other kinds of examples of that. For example, the way we buy food and the food production system. So we go to the supermarket, we buy our meat in little styrofoam containers wrapped in cellophane. We know nothing about the lives of the animals that we're eating, how they got there, and the conditions under which they are raised. And to a large extent, we don't want to know, right? So even if we are well-intentioned, ethical people, we're isolated, and that's the purpose of the whole food production system, distribution and sale of food, is that we are protected from the ugliness of all of that. And that's just, and there are many more examples of that, is that, we are players in this now very complex system that we call modern civilization.
Mm.
But that means that there are things that we simply don't have to know about, things that are actually critical to the maintenance of life.
Yeah, I think that the impetus for this kind of thing, right? Like this thing where we had these kinds of system emerge, like distribution of food and all this stuff, like the industries that have put on a veil on our eyes towards certain kinds of like processes, which are fundamental for us when we were more like living in smaller, perhaps groups, where it's like just survival through this territory we're moving in, water, its location, I don't know, like hunting, gazelle and all that stuff, right? All these different things. Whereas you're describing our current, subjective experience of being human in this cultural milieu is, we are no longer exposed to that at all in some ways. And I wonder if it has its basis in our, when militaries, like when large scale warfare, like World War II, World War I, they figured out how to feed lots and lots of people at the same time. It was an interesting cultural complexification and our ability to do something at such a large scale and just in a sustained way. And and when we were to switch back, they switched back the war was over and now the distribution system was in place. And I don't know if there was like, it was just kind of a natural evolutionary, like a side effect in some ways. But I think, unlike an individual who can reflect on his life, we don't come together as groups to reflect on life. But I think that the counter technology for that has become this internet, where like humans can interact across the globe, and now no longer will like our consciousness of certain kinds of our own like actions will be completely, like it also has the potential for abuse, obviously, because TV and media, etc., like what we call it, doesn't always reflect a very good, well thought out consensus or correspondence to the truth on various matters. So people don't really always get the right picture from there either.
Well, earlier we were talking about learning and, regretting the fact that we don't have time to study everything that we might be interested in.
Right.
And I guess what I'm suggesting here is that we are players in a very complex system that to a large extent we don't understand. So what happens after you flush the toilet? Very few people would be able to give you much of an answer to that. And we don't think about it until we have a plumbing problem. And suddenly at least part of it becomes apparent to us. So we are absolutely dependent on a system that in many respects we don't understand. So again, I'm not sure which way we need to go. And when we are talking about the human species. Is it to go back toward a more pre-modern way of life, which would be very difficult given that we have what's the global population now? Something like 7.5 billion people.
Right.
That's the number that comes to mind. I could be way.
I'm not sure the exact number, but it's like roughly speaking.
So I don't think subsistence farming or hunter gathering is an option anymore. And so now we're sort of stuck with the technological project that whatever problems come up, we need a technological. I mean, climate change is a very good example of that, right? Where we know that our use of fossil fuel is causing a very serious problem. How do we deal with this? And part of it has to be technology. Okay, is it going to be fusion technology? That's a very early experimental stage. But again, that's placing your bets on the development of yet more technology, which will enable us to transcend a fossil fuel-based culture. So that's the paradox that we're living. Should we push on toward a technological future, even more technology, more sophisticated technology, or do we retrace our steps a little? I don't know.
Hmm.
Should we talk about Reality Plus, by the way? Because you mentioned it. We started discussing that, and we got
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about it.
By the way, it's a very readable book. Chalmers wrote it for a general audience. It's what is called a trade book, so it's not written for academic philosophers.
Hmm.
In fact, you could use it as an introductory philosophy textbook. It would work very well in that kind of a setting. So it's free of a lot of academic jargon, and he introduces the concepts he's talking about in a way which would make it accessible to someone who knows nothing about philosophy at all.
Oh wow! Okay. Wow.
So it's very readable, but it does contain some ideas which require some careful reflection. David Chalmers, by the way, is well known in the area of philosophy of mind. He's at New York University. He comes from a background in mathematics. He switched from mathematics into philosophy fairly late in his academic career. And he is famous for having coined the term the hard problem of consciousness.
Right. I remember that from your class.
You're familiar with that. The hard problem being that how do we develop a scientific explanation of consciousness, given that consciousness is subjective, right? So how do we explain the subjective character of sights and sounds and tastes? How do we account for that according to scientific concepts, the language of neurophysiology? And as Chalmers has pointed out, science explains things in terms of their structure and function. That's what chemistry and physics are all about. But there's not so much room in an account rendered in terms of structure and function for consciousness, or what philosophers call qualia, right? The subjective character of consciousness. Thomas Nagel, there's something that it is like to be. There's just something that's like to be a human being in terms of sights and colors and sounds. Now, there are different opinions on what Chalmers called the hard problem, but that phrase pops up everywhere now. And for example, some people would say it's not a real problem at all. As we push forward with cognitive science, we'll find an explanation for consciousness. And I think we have to accept that that's a definite possibility. I like to compare the consciousness problem with a problem we had, say, a century ago around the notion of life, because for a very long time there were people that say, well, okay, so we understand biology, we understand human physiology in physical and chemical terms, but those explanations leave something out. What makes the machine, which is the body, alive? This is an ancient view. I mean, this goes back to views of this kind go back to ancient Greece, called vitalism, and you'll find counterparts in the philosophies of the East. The Chinese notion of qi, for example, would be the case of that, in which you got the physical body, which is animated by something which is intangible, spiritual, right? In the Greeks, Anaximander, air is the fundamental substance, and air, or the Greek word pneuma, is associated with spirit, right? It's invisible, but it's essential to maintaining life. The Greeks didn't understand the process of respiration. They didn't know anything about oxygen. So breathing was a mysterious process, right? And at a certain point, it's not as if one day somebody came up with a refutation of vitalism. It just slowly dropped out of the conversation. There was just nothing about the body which required explanation in non-physical terms. And so just, you're not going to meet a vitalist these days in the world of science or medicine.
But I wonder if, I'm just going to ask this more
Sure.
as a question, is I wonder if all of what we call religion or at least spirituality within religion, is perhaps a demonstration of that very sort of ideas, like vitalism. Like anybody who's spiritual will infuse the world with a not like a secondary quality, but almost like they would call it a primary quality, like of experience, right? Like you have ideas of idealism, and and it's the ideas of Hoffman, like consciousness as a parallel, co-evolving thing, like a complexification of units of consciousness and things like that.
Yeah. So, well, the whole question of religion, that's another big topic that we can get into here.
Mm-hmm.
But to the point you've just raised, the concept of consciousness is maybe the last vestige of a sort of spiritualism, because some people take the view against the notion that eventually we'll reduce consciousness to an explanation in terms of neurophysiology. That's not reducible. In other words, the hard problem has no solution. If by solution what you mean is reduction, right? Reduction to an explanation in terms of the chemistry of the brain, electrochemistry of the brain, and the way the brain encodes and manages and transmits information. Right? There's something irreducible about that. Okay, and there are different theories that account for that in terms of maybe is consciousness an emergent property of the brain, and that would be strong emergence. That with consciousness, you've got something essentially new in nature, which is not explicable in terms of the underlying sort of physical properties which give rise to it.
So that's very interesting. I find that fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, as you know, there's quite a menu of options when you're looking at the notion of consciousness, and so you got people in philosophy, computer science, cognitive science. It goes on and on. Many different fields looking at the question of consciousness from different perspectives, and so far a lot of conjecture. Because how do we go about testing our theories experimentally? So one which is getting a lot of attention these days is Tononi's integrated information theory, which
Tononi's integrated information theory.
That's a mathematical approach to consciousness. He's got this notion of phi. Let's not get into that here because we want to talk about Chalmers. But one of the virtues of Tononi's view is
I love that there are portals that you open that we can.
Yeah. So, but by the way, Tononi wrote a book entitled Phi, which you can look up, and it's just Google Tononi, Giorgio Tononi. I'm probably pronouncing it. Okay. And you'll find there's lots that's being written and said about his views right now.
Okay. And he's a mathematician, you said?
I'm not sure what his background is precisely. He is using mathematics to try to explain consciousness. It's a mathematical theory.
And okay. Maybe I'll ask you to that name just to type it later if you.
Yeah. So it's just as it sounds, Tononi, Tononi. Toni. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's example. Now, the interesting thing about that theory is that it's at least in principle testable empirically. So we're now starting to get theories of consciousness that sort of fit within the sphere of science in the sense that we can at least imagine ways that it might be tested. That's promising. So maybe we'll find that once we get to the experimental stage, the theory doesn't bear up. That's okay. It's at least encouraging. We're at the point now where we are developing theories which may be tested.
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, a lot of options here. Now, Chalmers, I'd say, is one of the most influential figures in philosophy of mind. At New York University, one of his colleagues is Ned Block, who is also a big name in the world of consciousness studies. Chalmers and Block at New York University, every spring, they have a conference. It's the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which is held at New York University. They're going to have it this year, June 22nd, I think. So there's a lot going on at NYU. And so Reality Plus is a book which has come out of that milieu. Now, to Reality Plus itself. What Chalmers is talking about there is what has become known as the simulation hypothesis, which is the
simulation hypothesis.
The simulation hypothesis, which is the idea that what we take to be physical reality is actually a digital simulation of reality. Now, that's a view which Chalmers borrows heavily for the foundation of it from a paper written by Nick Bostrom at Oxford University. Bostrom is a philosopher at Oxford University. He is part of it's the Center for I think it's called the Future of Humanity at Oxford. And it's a group of people, different disciplines, who work on thinking about the existential threats facing humanity. And Bostrom wrote a book a few years ago, it's very good, entitled Superintelligence, in which he warns us about the dangers inherent in artificial intelligence. And you've probably heard other people voicing concerns about this. What happens when we have computers that equal humans in terms of general intelligence? And then from there, of course, they will very quickly develop into entities which are much more intelligent than we are. And we have never, as a species, dealt with things that are more intelligent than we are. So that there's the potential for all kinds of problems there. So anyway, Bostrom wrote this paper. It was entitled, I think the title is, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And it's a very simple argument. It goes like this. First of all, yes, it's possible. It is possible. And the only things that would preclude the possibility that we're
this is really good. I want to know. Yes.
Yeah, the only things that would stand in the way of computer simulation would be if advanced technological civilizations don't survive long enough to develop the technology required. So to have digital technology capable of supporting a simulation of the world that we experience, because we would have to be much more advanced than what we have now, right? It would probably require quantum computing, which we're now
working on.
We've been working on it for a couple of decades at least, and I don't think that quantum computing is ready for prime time in terms of commercial applicability, but they're working on it. So simulating the world that we experience would require much more advanced. How long would that take? Well, I mean, I like to point out to people that my grandparents were born before the invention of radio. My parents were born before the invention of television. And I remember the introduction. Well, computers are invented before I came along, but I remember the introduction of pocket calculators, which people were astounded by these things, right? This something you could hold in the palm of your hand, and you could type in a multiplication problem, instantly get an answer. Because before that, what we had were mechanical calculating machines, like a little typewriter, right? Type in the number, it goes clickety-clack, and you get an answer. So the speed at which technology, this is 3 generations in my family. So what are we going to have in another 100 years? I mean, it's difficult to imagine, right? So, but then the question is, in order to have that kind of technology, of course, you have to be a fairly advanced civilization. And is it an implication of this, that society of that kind will destroy itself through the things that we've been talking about today. Nuclear war, resource depletion, and so on. Okay, now, that's one. The other possibility is, would advanced civilizations for some reason decide not to, although they had the technology, they would decide not to create simulations of a world like ours. It could be like an ethical concern that we shouldn't create sentient beings, right? So if conscious beings are part of it, if we are part of a simulation, right, conscious beings, it is unethical to create things that will suffer. We're capable of experiencing pain. Now, you would have to have convergence on this idea. So all advanced civilizations then would have to reach the conclusion that it would be wrong to do so. Now, Chalmers thinks that it's unlikely that both of those things would happen. I mean, sure, we know from our own example that sure, we have weapons of mass destruction, and with the war in Ukraine, it could all be over in a few weeks or months, right? But would that necessarily be the case with all advanced civilizations? All advanced civilizations come to the conclusion that it's wrong. So we're talking.
I think all three probably happened in the history of the universe. You know, you had species that probably couldn't get to that point. You had species that got to that point, and you probably had species that perhaps did create sentient beings. And in other words, it to me it relates to the idea in Buddhism, which is that karma. It's this the karma is really just process. It means action. It means like consequence. It's this interconnected web of actions impacting and creating conditions and giving rise to things. And it's inevitable that we came to be somehow, right? Like we could say that it wasn't the work of some specific species, but it was the work of the same place, it was the same universe. It's just this ongoing unfolding. And I think that what you're describing is quite likely, and I wonder that the speed at which this evolution is proceeding, because you mentioned the radio waves, and then now we're getting to the point of quantum computing, and then we have the ability to create also AI, and combined with these two things, the path on for humanity looks very different in some ways from our past of the last 100,000 years, maybe even more, especially over the last 5,000 years, because of, like you said, the technological bringing in. But I feel like the component of mental training can still be incorporated, and probably is now even more important given the kind of changes we're going through, such as our ability to create sentience, like the direct consequences of our actions not only permeate the physical world in terms of our nuclear powers, but the psychological world in terms of the kind of upheavals we can cause in various realms. I don't know, maybe it's weirdly, I want to say past and the future, but I don't know if that's correct.
Are you familiar with the Drake equation, by the way?
The Drake equation? No, I'm so familiar with so many things, man. Drake equation.
Yeah. So the Drake equation, it's sort of named after its inventor, who developed it. I think it was 1961 or so.
The probabilistic argument used to estimate the number of active communicative extraterrestrial cells. Yes. Oh, interesting.
About the likelihood that there are intelligent beings, technological beings on other planets, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the variables, there are a lot of variables in this. So, I mean, you can fill in the variables with whatever values you like, and we have some evidence that we can draw upon. But of course, one of the variables, again, was this. Although we can reasonably suppose that there are intelligent creatures on a planet somewhere else in the universe, how long will an advanced civilization last before it destroys itself? And of course, it's difficult to attach a number, a probability to that. isn't it?
Mm.
Anyway, the Bostrom argument runs, barring these two things, right? So if we can suppose that some civilizations will last long enough to develop this very advanced digital technology, the kind of technology and computing power necessary to run a complex simulation, which the world we experience would have to be. And given that not all advanced civilizations will converge on the idea that it would be unethical to do so, then it is likely that we are living a simulation. Okay, why is it likely? Because think about our computer technology. Something like Microsoft Office Suite is a sophisticated piece of software which took many years to develop. Once it's developed, you can make an unlimited number of copies easily, inexpensively, right? And similarly, if you had the technology to develop if you had simulation technology, if you had that kind of software available, again, you could make multiple copies. And so based on that idea, it is more likely that we are living a simulation than that the world that we are living, and including us, is the product of natural history and evolution, which of course takes a very long time. And it's a pretty precarious process. So the interesting thing about it is it's not just the argument that it's possible that we're living a simulation, but it's actually likely, right? So if, discounting the two, what Chalmers calls sim blockers, right? An argument against the possibility of the simulation hypothesis. There's
sim blockers.
So if you don't have a good sim blocker, you're faced with the conclusion that it's likely that we're living in a simulation. Now, Elon Musk has commented on this when asked at a conference about, he said he thinks about this a lot, and he voiced the opinion that the odds that we aren't in a simulation are billions to one. And prove to me that I'm wrong. Okay, so where's the billions to one come from? Well, that's just pulled out of thin air. And so we can talk about the probabilities here, and there's a literature developing on that. And so it's going to vary depending on a number of things. For example, to create a digital simulation of something, it has to be computable. And is consciousness computable? Well, Chalmers says, I don't know, I'm not sure about that. And again, that's back to the question of that if we don't know what consciousness is, and we're not in a good position to talk about whether or not it's computable and what would be necessary to make it computable. The human central nervous system is very complex. Again, hard problem of consciousness. Is that something we could simulate? So you have to put a question mark beside that, as Chalmers does, right? You can also entertain the distinction between pure simulation and partial simulation. So you probably, when you're studying philosophy, you came across the brain in the vat scenario. What if our brain was removed from our body and connected to a computer, so the brain is floating around in a vat, but whoever is running the computer is providing this brain, disembodied brain, with the inputs which amount to ordinary sensory experience. Okay, is there any way you know that you couldn't, or is there any way you could know that you're not a brain in a vat? You know, that kind of scenario, right? So that idea is an impure simulation in the sense that the brain, the central nervous system, remains a biological entity, but it is subject to a digital simulation of reality, right? So there are different scenarios are possible here. So anyway, Chalmers then is making the Bostrom argument the foundation for this book. So he accepts the argument largely. Yes, it is indeed possible, first of all, and there is a significant likelihood that, in fact, what we are subject to is a simulation. Now, if I were doing a review of the book, one of the things that worries me about what he's doing is that he sort of piles improbabilities on top of each other. And I'll give an example of this.
Okay.
When it comes to, much of this argument is going to revolve around what is computable and what isn't. Now that gets you into an area of computer science, right? Sort of theory of computation, what is computable and what is not. That sort of goes back to the early days of computing. But he draws upon the work of a physicist named John Wheeler. Are you familiar with his work at all?
John Wheeler? No, I'm not. I'm not familiar with John Wheeler's work.
Yeah, so he's one of the giants of physics of the 20th century. He, along with a number of other big names, worked on the Manhattan Project. He was born, I think, born around 1910, 1911. So his life sort of spanned that very revolutionary era of physics before the Second World War, through the Manhattan Project, into post-war work. I think he died, I'd have to look this up, but 1990 or so. I could be off by 10 years or so. Anyway, he claimed that fundamental reality is information. So basic reality is information.
That's Wheeler's point.
It's not particles, it's not atoms, neutrons, protons, and so on, but it is information, right? Now that's not the consensus view in the world of physics, right? So
it hooks up to sorry, go ahead. So you're saying that this notion that information is not the foundational idea is not something you usually find, because we usually talk about different components of atoms and molecules and their interactions as the underlying foundation for. But that's where I also saw that Hoffman was sort of saying making similar claims in some sense, right? That idea that consciousness is the fundamental component, like degrees of consciousness in some ways.
Yeah, so I think in physics, to walk up to a physicist and ask them the question, I think the answer you'll typically get is that when you're talking about fundamental reality, you are talking about the fundamental particles that constitute matter. Mm-hmm. So you would have to talk about the building blocks of the atom, the building blocks of, I think electrons don't have component parts, but protons do. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure, I'm not a physicist. But when you're talking fundamental particles, you need to talk about things like leptons, which are the component parts of
what we consider the material world, like tables and chairs.
But anyway, fundamental reality we still understand in terms of matter,
right?
Physical entities. Just a question of what is fundamental.
Right. And I was hooking it up to the stuff that we studied with respect to the people who were thinking in the 15th, 16th century, right? Like they were like having this debate between whether it's all ideas or it's all like bodies, sort of the this empiricism versus rationalism debate that was raging for a while.
Yeah. So the early modern, or if you like the Enlightenment period, saw science diverge from religion. So famously the trial of Galileo and so on. And Galileo took the view that, he said the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So,
I thought it was in Arabic, though. I thought it was in Arabic. I'm just making a joke.
Okay. I didn't catch the.
Oh, no, I've been reading the Quran recently. I have the Quran right here.
Okay. Yeah.
So I was just making that joke.
Okay. Yeah.
The book of nature is written in mathematics.
Sure. Okay. So in other words, if you take Galileo's book on the scientific method, his writings on science to be foundational, so the idea upon which Enlightenment science is based is that the way to understand physical reality is in terms of bodies in motion. And so it's the mathematics, the mathematical principles are at work by which we understand the laws of motion and so on. And it turned out to be a very fruitful approach. And he also encouraged us to focus on the primary, what he called the primary qualities of things, things that can be measured. In other words, they're objective in the sense that can be measured. We can agree on them, as opposed to secondary qualities like, say, taste, which might vary from one individual to another, difficult or impossible to quantify. Anyway, I think that's the premise. If you are a physicist, I think this is going to be your view, is that physical reality, what we talk about in terms of fundamental reality, we understand in terms of some physical entity, whether it's quarks and leptons, whether something more fundamental like Higgs boson, I think was the last major discovery in terms of fundamental particle, the Hadron Super Collider, and so on. So the idea that it's not physical entities, but information, which is fundamental, is a departure from the consensus in the physics world. And what Wheeler's view can be summed up in one phrase: it from bit. The it from bit view. So it is the physical world. Of course, bit is the information, right? And a bit is inherently information, right? So 1 or 0 in computing, true, false, yes, no, so on. So that's Wheeler's view, and Chalmers is building on that in this work. Now, it's not absolutely necessary to Chalmers' view, because there are different ways we can understand this. For example, if we are living a simulation which has been created by someone else, someone in another world, another part of the universe, they might be living in a world which has a different physics from ours. And so the physics that we know, and which we study through the science of physics, is one which has been constructed or programmed into the system. Right? There are all kinds of possibilities here. If someone is doing it, someone has to create the simulation. Now, you could understand that to be a god. That sort of dovetails nicely with the Judeo-Christian tradition, doesn't it? Because that's pretty much what creationism has always supposed. Or it could be a teenage girl on the next level up. We don't know, right? That's an interesting question itself, is if indeed we are living a simulation, is there any way that we could determine this to be a simulation? Is there anything we could discover about our world which would be an indication that it's a simulation? Another good question to ask.
Yeah, but I mean, if the world is bits, then maybe calling it a simulation might even be a mistake in the first place, no? In some sense? Like, if you were to take that picture that the world inherently is bits, or like the its and the bits are connected in some sense, and they are just ongoing manifestations of each other in some ways,
Yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities here, and this I think is you got to read the book.
Yeah, no, I'm connecting it to the religious thing, because I know that's also one of your expertise.
Sure.
Or interests.
Yeah, this is okay. So on the religion side, I mean, again, there's always been this sort of creationism, which is in part of rational theology. And recently, I don't know if you're familiar with this area or not, but early in the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, who was an atheist, he wrote a book entitled "Why I'm Not a Christian."
Yes, I read that book, and I read it.
And one of the points he makes is that what we've discovered through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment is that the universe is much larger than the ancients supposed. and that means it's much emptier, devoid of life. So here we have planet Earth. We're in the outskirts of the Milky Way galaxy.
We are.
Where the action is, really.
Right.
So here we are in the middle of nowhere with nothing going on. So we do have life on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
But it just, our understanding of the situation that we're in on Earth makes it just less and less likely that this is the product of an intelligent designer creator, right? Compare that with the days prior to Copernicus, when we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. Everything revolves around the Earth, right? And so we are God's special creation, that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's
the way that I would think, like the way the Muslims respond to that, they say that, like, look, the fact that we are found so remotely in the universe is almost like a blessing from the Lord above, that we are blessed, that we are not, because other species would have been interfering. And they talk about their, Islam, they have the idea of other beings, like they talk about, like, in different words, like beings that are just completely one with reality, and other beings that are just like humans, and they're just traveling the universe over time, and all these ideas. And so they say that we're lucky as humans because we are situated far away from many of the drama of the intergalactic drama. Like we have the time to hatch through, and and that makes it special for God. But in some ways we don't understand the mystery of it all. So
although that's an all-purpose excuse, isn't it? God works in mysterious ways.
That's how religion. That's the best explanation for religion. Philosophy, religion. It's a mystery. Yeah, and at that point,
atheists find that very annoying, because every time something difficult comes up, well, God works in mysterious ways, so you can't expect us to answer that.
But I think that at that point, the religious people, the move that they're making is really just. And I think that the only legitimate move they would have would be to just acknowledge reality and God as somewhat of, words for the similar, like, or the same thing, perhaps even, because, in some ways, the idea in the Quran is not that, like, these people, it's not claiming that, like, God is necessarily the interconnectedness among the various components. It's almost like they're using the word universe and God in many ways the same, or the force. I feel like the force is a really good word. If you read the Quran and everywhere it says God, you just switch it out with force, it's a much better reading.
That sounds Star Wars.
Yeah. It's so true.
Okay, so here's how I think you'll find this point interesting. Recall that if you go back to Bostrom's paper on the simulation, part of it, and a really interesting part of it, is that it's not just that he's making a case for the possibility that we're living a simulation, but it makes it more probable. Mm-hmm. And Chalmers, he doesn't talk about religion very much, but he does acknowledge the possible connection here, who says that this is not just another argument for the existence of God. We've seen those past, but it's actually a stronger argument. Right? For the same reason. Not only is it possible that we're living a simulation, but it's more likely if you accept Bostrom's argument. Now, just to get back to the Russell, I mean, your point about that, well, maybe it's better to be out here in the suburbs or out in the boonies.
Yeah.
Sure. Again, there's a certain prejudice there. It's the same somebody who would say, like, John, well, you want to be here at NYU. We're in Manhattan. This is the center of the world, right?
Yeah.
Would say, well, no, thank you. I like living in the country, out on my own. So it's just
because we're young, man. We're young. We have to move up. With this AI and quantum computing, we're about to join the great escapade of the galactic. We're about to join the party. It's not too late, not too long, but it's how are we going to arrive there? My concerns are in many ways about that, because humans are suddenly about to become even giganormously more powerful, because our impact is going to escape just one single world. It's becoming multi-worldly. Like we can destroy an entire, and we did that to each other. We can do it to other species we encounter. We might just be so reckless we might not realize what other species are evolving on those planets that had futures like ours. Like, our view of the evolution is like, in other words, like that's my concern for even why I'm starting to talk to you and other people about this kind of stuff, because I'm just concerned about those. And I think those are fundamental concerns where even as atheists and scientists and everybody can come together, and even religious people, because it's like ultimately it's a long view of the universe's history itself, and not considering ourselves as so special in the simulation or the evolution that we forget that,
that's an important consideration as well. By what right would we extend our reach to other worlds and interfere with? But anyway, so from the Russell point of view, which is early 20th century, what happened subsequently was, are you familiar with the anthropic cosmological principle?
Oh, tell me, what is it called?
The anthropic cosmological principle.
Anthropic cosmological.
This is cosmic fine-tuning. Have you come across that?
No.
Yeah. So
observation selection.
I'm not sure how far this goes. I know that Barrow and Tipler were writing about this, I think in the mid 80s.
Okay.
And it's the idea that what physics has made apparent, what cosmology and physics has made apparent to us, is that the physical constraints on life are actually extremely narrow, meaning that if you look at the way that the universe is constituted in terms of the basic physical constants at work, something like the cosmological constant, for example, which determines we're living in an expanding universe, right, following the Big Bang. And the rate of expansion is critical, because if it was any faster or any slower, there is a range in which it's not an extremely precise number, but it's pretty narrow. Faster or slower, and you wouldn't get bodies like stars and planets, which are probably requisite for the evolution of life. There are other constants. I think is it the fine structure constant, which, if it were slightly other than what it is, has to do with the constitution of atoms, then physical reality would consist of a sea of neutrons. Now, people point out that when we're talking about the conditions for life, it's life as we know it. And so life might develop. Yes, that's true. But are you really going to have life in a universe which consists of an ocean of neutrons? I don't think so. Again, my understanding is limited. My imagination is certainly limited. There's no sort of a reliable guide to what is possible or not. But then there are many other, I think there's a list of something like 26 physical constants, all of which are arguably crucial to the creation of the kind of world in which we find ourselves. Now, is this evidence that we live in a universe which was designed? Okay, so is this evidence of intelligent design and creation? Well, there are a number of responses. One is no, because we're just lucky. There's no such thing as too fluky. It's like a frog on a lily pad in July, lots of flies around. He's thinking, this world was created for me. It's perfect, right? These are ideal conditions. Okay. Without those conditions, Mr. Frog wouldn't exist in the first place. He was lucky. He's lucky to be alive, right?
Yeah, and in that sense, we are lucky to be alive because, the conditions created us and we create the conditions. There's like an feedback loop between even if religious people, like if we're to grant this picture, we'd still have to say that God and the beings evolved co-parallelly. In other words, it's like, it's like the idea of like, you cannot divorce, you can, even if you accept creationism, you'd still have to accept the fact that like there's a process of evolution going on that is continuously changing the environment and the species, because the environment and the organism are not entirely separate. It's like a complex, it's this sort of the Whitehead idea, like that this all process, it's all interconnected process. And in that sense, I think that the whole idea of religion is not wrong. It's just misguided the way we understand, or the most people are led to believe what it is. Because for me, it's like the interconnected matrix of things, and that interconnection, connectedness itself is what different religions celebrate under different names. The fact that, there's a monorealism, instead of monotheism, like a lot of, at least the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, it's a monorealistic framework. It's like we are part of this one reality, and that also gives credence to science, because now we can say like, oh, if it's one reality, we can all study it from the same tool, right? In some ways.
Yeah.
So that's been my thoughts lately on some of the Judeo-Christian, and mostly for me it's Quran, but that incorporates the Christian and the Jewish,
which is let's call it the Abrahamic religions, which includes Judeo-Christian Islam, right?
Yes, Mr. Abraham, he's quite a guy. And I wonder, one other very materialistic part of my brain tries to give explanation to religion is that it's just a way for your, like, there's these different beings that realize, okay, if my progeny is going to survive, here are the principles, and if they've followed this, I will live on forever. In other words, it was the person saying like, my descendants will be safe from destruction. And you can see that with the Jewish people. They have successfully protected their genetic heritage for centuries. The Muslims have done the same, but their approach has been, no, if you can respectfully breed with others, you can even further consolidate your genetic pool, because they're also kind of, and the Christian approach was also the same. It came from the Jewish approach, but then it realized like, okay, we can stay in the genetic world by through opening up to others too. Obviously, it's been hard because different cultures are so, because from that perspective, our cultural and religious identities are just ways to protect our genetic data over time. It's like, like if we have this empire and it lasts for X number of years, then the people living in it would be safe, and that means the genetic data would be safe. But then, of course, like, that wasn't good enough, because empires would fight, and then so people created even stronger, like religion, like where it's like, instead of something physical, it becomes something more abstract. So now we are united under the symbol of the cross, or something like that. And now that increases the group in which we can have our genetic data safeguarded. Which is being continuously being, sent forward in time, kind of thing. And then, like, so in many ways, then we can see that religions are more successful than empires, because Muslims can say they feel safe in their 1.1 billion tribe. Jews can say they feel safe in their 300 million tribe. The Christians can say they feel safe in their 2 billion tribe. So whatever religions are left are the religions whose people are left, in other words. So in other words, religion was the gift that people resurrected to keep themselves alive through centuries. In other words, their genetic data is like, so that's other part of my brain goes to that, and it's like, and the idea of God, of something greater than ourselves, something transcending us, allowed them to kind of, and I don't know if that because there is something transcendent, you don't have to believe in it. It's just that, like, it's just this interconnected, like, relational web that is just unfolding over time. It's just something going on, we don't know. So the mystery for me is there, regardless of whether we call it something or not. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about religion another time. Right?
Okay, sorry, I'm getting pulled in so many directions, because I know you have so many ideas that are very like the web of your knowledge to me is very interesting, because I find very similar things very, very fascinating. So I really enjoyed that. That logic class was really good for me too.
the thing about philosophy is it's a discipline which is at the intersection of a lot of things. So, you're talking about philosophy of mind. While you're reading Chalmers, you're at the intersection of philosophy on the one hand, physics on another, mathematics on another, biology is the other.
Mhm.
And we started out talking about the fact, it's a shame that we don't have time to study all these things. So you have to sort of struggle along with sort of limited knowledge, in my case, of physics, right?
Mhm.
So anyway, just to finish off on the cosmic fine-tuning idea.
Okay.
So there is this sort of interesting situation in which you have to recognize that the parameters or physical constraints necessary for the emergence of life are very narrow, and this will, inevitably get you thinking about is that evidence for creationism, that the world as we find it is the product of an intelligent designer after all? Well, on Chalmers' view, maybe this could be taken as at least modest evidence for the simulation hypothesis. So this might bump our credences up a little bit. It's just that makes it a little bit more likely that we're living a simulation. But the responses to cosmic fine-tuning are, one, we're just lucky, so what? Nothing to see here. Another is variations on theories like the multiverse, many worlds, bubble universes. In other words, some version of the view that there are many universes, maybe an infinite number of universes, if that helps. And so we're living one possibility of innumerable worlds. And so there's nothing particularly special or magical or anything that requires explanation in terms of supernatural intervention. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that because Chalmers does recognize, the potential for, a religious connection here. Chalmers himself has always been an atheist, never sort of bought into religion in any way, but he does state that religion has never seemed more plausible. Except when you're looking at the simulation hypothesis.
And I think that if this was the case, then a lot of religions would also be true, but they would also have to fundamentally alter their ethical. Like if this is this is the case, that reality is such, and that we are in this information and atom loop, and all these ideas are correct, and religion might be true in the fundamental sense, but it still will not lend credence to all its various beliefs, all its various manifestations and all its various in other words, believing in God and religion are not necessarily the same thing either, in other words.
Yes. Yeah. So again, we should probably have another session on religion. Because to your point earlier, I think that religion is very effective in uniting people as part of groups, establishing group identity. So the collective participation in religious ritual is very effective. And I worry somewhat that with the decline of religion in the West, we're moving, I think, increasingly in the direction of a secular society. Would you agree?
A secular society.
Secular society, right? So fewer people go to church, fewer people identify or associate with a religion now. Some countries like Sweden, I think the majority of the population identifies atheist. And so for a couple of generations ago, we're probably the majority of people went to church on Sunday, right? And so I think what we've seen since the dawn of the Enlightenment is just a gradual decline of religion from the position that it had.
Oh, yes. I think that also my materialistic brain will bring it back to like, okay, look how religion is very much more functional in like times where your material environment is more and more out of your control. It's, your strength is in your unity. It's strength when your material environment does not guarantee that your progeny will propagate, that your genetic data will be safe. People tend to like, find their solace in religion in many ways because it allows them to, get a sense that like, okay, they're part of something bigger, and so like they might be able to get through to the next generations in there. Whereas like in a modern Western state, especially in some of these more isolated ones, like they've really come to kind of create conditions where people don't really feel so worried about that their progeny is at risk. They feel like, they can keep going, and the thing, So I don't know if there's some kind of like biological reasons behind religion, but it seems like it's pervasive and doesn't seem to be going away. And I think it will just continue to come with us into our next steps in evolution. It just would just become something completely different. It's just.
I guess I'm inclined to agree. I just finished reading a book by Tom Holland, which is entitled Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. And it's really work of history. It's quite a detailed read, 700 pages.
Okay.
And he starts with.
I'm going to write that down.
Tom Holland. It's very well written. Whether you end up agreeing or disagreeing with him, he's a terrific writer. Okay. And he starts with.
It's the book.
It's called Dominion, : The Making of the Western Mind.
Nice. Okay.
So he starts in the Roman world. Of course, Christianity sort of born during the days of the Roman Empire.
Right.
Somewhat surprisingly, maybe, given that the sort of values that Christianity represent were sort of just seriously inconsistent with those of the Roman world.
Yeah, it was the antithesis to the thesis of the Roman.
Yeah,
the synthesis led us to this world. It's I really tend to see this historical development from like a Hegelian point of view too. Just how history is intricately related with the development of consciousness.
Okay. Yeah.
And then that kind of for me fits in with our biological sort of ideas too.
Well, I guess I'm generally in agreement with that, because I don't mind talking about the human journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that,
we're talking about Chalmers, so
over the millennia,
mm-hmm.
we have, collectively as a species been on a journey. We've made certain discoveries. We've made a lot of mistakes, right?
Yeah.
And Holland's thesis is that even with the decline of organized religion, our intuitions about ethics remain religious.
Mm.
And, the idea that everyone has inherent value as a human being, you can trace back to the Christian idea that we are made in the image of God, and so we matter for that reason, which is not what the Romans thought. Life was cheap for the Romans.
Life was cheap. They would kill people like it was no problem. Yeah.
Yeah. A rebellious slave would be executed in the slowest, most painful way possible. So the modern notion of human rights is really a secularization of religious values.
In their fundamental sense, at least the way their reformers started the religions, you know what I mean? Like you find the same sort of attitudes in the early beginnings of other religions too, where antithesis to the human cruelty, people dying of hunger, starvation. Islam is born in a very like dark place. The same as the Roman Empire of the time period too.
We sometimes forget just how alien the ancient world was from a modern standpoint, because both Romans and the Greeks were accepting of infanticide. Right? So you put the newborn infant outside to expose it, so it is taken by the gods, is the way that they would describe it. But with Christian values comes the idea that everyone has inherent worth as creatures of God. And so infanticide is no longer
beings of the force,
Yeah. So the idea that now that we have these human rights sort of enshrined in the UN Charter of Rights and so on. These are abstractions. What is their source? So anyway, cut a long story short. I guess one of the things I think about, which we could probably talk about more, is if, for example, religion is the scaffolding that we use to build a modern notion of rights, can we now do without the scaffolding? Holland's idea is that even if you are an atheist, you're a humanist, you're a naturalist, you still swim in religious waters. You still have religious intuitions. Now, if that's so, it seems plausible to me. As the generations go by, will we lose that? And so do we return to something more like the Roman way of looking at the world? I don't know. If so, that's something we need to worry about.
Yeah, the Roman way is extremely rational in some ways. The Romans created one of the world's best armies because they became extremely precise and scientific about everything. They became detailed oriented to the core. They were the extreme definition of left brain, like, how do you say, like, conquest of nature in some sense, but it was conquest of other tribes mostly, but it was part of this whole idea of, like, we can change the world. It's like very much like our current sort of way of thinking about capitalism, as we started out about technology, right? Like talking about that.
I think that's a fair comparison. And one way of looking at the Romans was that the Roman era was the beginning of what we have now, but the interruption was what we call the Dark Ages.
Right.
So, the fall of Rome and those centuries in which the church became the central organizing power.
Right.
And then we have the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, right?
Right.
The return to the light of reason. So what illuminated the ancient world, the light of reason, the Greeks and Romans, that was lost or smothered for several centuries. So that's a narrative, right? That's
a narrative that is very centers around like a few countries in the world. It's just the northern Mediterranean. It's basically the descendants of the Western Roman Empire in some ways. It's Britain, not modern day France, and not modern day Spain, some parts of North Africa, like Egypt and stuff, and these areas. But in many ways, or not even Egypt, but that would be Eastern Roman Empire. But like Western Roman Empire would be Italy, would be France, Germany, parts of Germany, England. Wherever the Western Roman Empire was, because they because in the East, the Greek was still known. People were still reading Greek authors. And the reason was because the Byzantines, the Eastern Roman empires, their official language had switched off to Greek, whereas the Westerns kept Latin. And so it's not that they didn't have access to Greek texts, but it's like as time went on, less and less people knew Greek in the Western Roman world. You have even up to Augustine, he could speak Greek, but he hated it. He talks about it in I think one of his books. He's like, "Oh, I hated those Greeks. I don't know why I had to read that shit." He's not into it. Whereas the Greek was still very much being taught in the East, and then obviously after the Byzantines, the Muslims took over, and then they started learning Greek, and so there was a lot of text translated from Greek to Arabic and things like that, and back to Latin from Spain and France and Sicily, and so. But regardless, we have humans becoming more or less rational about things. But I think that the difference was unlike the Romans, which were very like they were extremely, in many ways, their religion was not necessarily, the spiritual aspect of it was a very pragmatic religion. You had to go to the gods to pay money to hopefully get some blessings, and like it was like everything was business. Like it reminds me of the USA, the USA of the United States of America. They've got the dollar bill, they got the whole thing. They were trying to create. And then this is not to say that the Romans were not doing great things, because obviously it was a long time period, and they had some great engineering feats. But again, like you said, technology, right? It's the technology creating problems, and then technology being used to solve problems may not, because I don't know. In some cases, it might be more helpful for us to reflect on our use of technologies as well, and see, because in the grander scheme of things, like a more aware, self-aware human species, I don't know how we could get to that point. From your years of experience with education, do you have some ideas about how, like, perhaps our going forward, like how the education is going to look like, with the artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, all these things? It's going to be a fundamental change. Like, you have years of experience working in the university. Do you see differences, changes emerging in that area as well because of this, these kind of like changes in reality?
Yeah, that's that's huge. ChatGPT, now we're seeing the introduction of artificial intelligence in a way which immediately impacts the educational process. And again, like all technologies, for good and bad. What does that portend for something like university education? I'm really not sure. I mean, the classroom experience has changed for me because students in my class have cell phones. They have immediate access to this enormous fountain of information, right? So the days of the professor as this learned person with all the knowledge no longer holds, right? They can double check what you're saying in real time in the classroom and call you on it if you got it wrong. And the whole model of university began at a time when books were rare because they were expensive to produce. I mean, in David Hume's time at University of Edinburgh, the university had a library. You couldn't take a book out of the library. It was too valuable. You could sit and read it in the library. But books were a rare commodity. And so, education consisted of listening to someone who'd read a lot of books. Imagine, right? So, I mean, we were just talking about religion. Religion changed when the printing press was invented, Gutenberg. Right. And people could have their own copy of the Bible and read it for themselves. When it was translated,
Protestantism coming out within like a few hundred years.
Exactly. I mean, there's a direct line from the printing press to Martin Luther, right? That fundamentally changed religion. And so we could be in an era now. Where's this going? I don't know. I mean, I think that obviously we have to be worried about things like plagiarism. Is there any way you can tell that an essay is actually written by a student now? That's a question we're starting to ask. I think we can right now. In a few years, probably not. That's a problem. But on the other hand, I see some potential for the development of intellectual communities outside the university. And that's where, YouTube is so important now because there's a lot of intellectual content on YouTube.
Right.
And there are people developing good content, and they have subscribers who are interacting, forming their own online communities. And it's really positive. Now, there's a lot of stupidity out there and misinformation as well. That's a problem which is inherent in that technology. But I think there's some promise in that area. Maybe the model of university we have now is on its way to being obsolete, and education will take a different form. I would say of the students that I see now, they are very well informed, much more so than their predecessors or what where I was
Mm.
when I was at their stage, I never have to go to the library anymore.
Mm.
I do all my research online, all the journals that are online and so on. So, do we need a library anymore? Not the kind of work that I do.
Mm.
That's one of the questions that we're going to have to face. So, yeah, the education is going to have to change fundamentally. And again, in some ways that are not so good, and other ways that are much more positive. And I think you could say the same thing of religion. I mean, I don't know if you are or have been interested in Jordan Peterson
I
at
have
all.
heard of him. I haven't read his book yet. I read his one book, 12 Rules of Life, but his real thoughts are in his first book, and I haven't really read that one.
Okay, so I'm not really, I haven't really absorbed his ideas much. What interests me though is the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson, which is he's giving talks on books in the Old Testament, like Exodus, for example, and he's filling lecture theaters, he's filling auditoriums with people. He's on sort of lecture tour right now. You can pay $800 for a ticket to listen to Jordan Peterson. Now, okay, I mean, some people they're paying the money, so they think that it's valuable. But a couple of years ago, Sam Harris was appearing in Toronto at one of the auditoriums. He was going to be in conversation with Brian Greene, who's a string theory theorist. And I thought to myself briefly, hey, you know something? It'd be fun to take that in. Maybe I should book a trip to Toronto for the weekend.
Okay.
Well, until I looked at buying a ticket and found out that they're hundreds of dollars. And this is something I could probably get the discussion online for free later. So anyway, I didn't go.
That's interesting. So there's a new way that now academics and professors they're becoming, but then there's the problem of like the sophistry too, right?
Yeah. But
the old
what
problem.
encourages me about this, at very least, is that there are people who are willing to spend hundreds of dollars per ticket, not to see a rock band or a football game, but to see two people on a stage talking about ideas. So there is a hunger for ideas out there.
Right.
That's good. And we have the technological means now by which people can share. They can reach each other. They can form these online communities. And this might transcend the university, right? Where you go, you pay several $1,000s for an assortment of courses for whatever value they have to offer. So again, as always, there's going to be good and bad coming out of this.
Yeah, I wonder, like for philosophers, especially with the coming of ChatGPT and you just being able to ask it immediate questions and being able to give you those answers right away.
Yeah.
I wonder it would just actually a subject like philosophy that's already so contingent on information may even benefit from it. This condensation of data in a way where it can be presented in a meaningful way to a philosopher that's doing his research.
Yeah. I think that they have a way to go for philosophy. Right now, ChatGPT is very good at sort of answering particular questions. It's almost like the audio version of Wikipedia, right?
That's a pretty good analogy. Yeah.
Right. So if it's just information you want or have it explained to you, ChatGPT is already pretty good at that. Dealing with abstract ideas and sort of giving you, say, a coherent explanation of something like pragmatism, let's say. I think that's still a little bit beyond, but again, are we only maybe 5-10 years away from that? Where when you're trying
most humans as humans, we are not always able to do that either, though, right? Like that what you're describing as philosophical coherence in ideas is not something that ordinary humans are like always good at it either. But you're saying that, especially with abstract ideas,
sure. And that sort of opens up another question, the idea of artificial general intelligence and what lies beyond is that, there's some promise here. Once we get AI to that level, we can use AI to do science because we've got an entity with more intelligence than human scientists have.
Yeah.
And so people will make progress in certain areas where we haven't been able to move forward. Simply because
they did this. I forget his name. This guy, this engineer at NASA, he was trying to build this like little antenna for his spaceship or something like that, and he came up with a lot of iterations. But he just was like, okay, I have this artificial intelligence program. And it can probably create something better for me. But it's like an evolutionary program where you have to iterate it over and over and over to come to the improved product. So NASA would not listen to him. And after a while, he was able to get the permission. And then he went and did it. And then we came back home. He was like, I couldn't believe it because after all these hundreds of iterations, it gave it a design for a little safety pin.
Yeah.
It's like a safety pin. Like, what is this insanity? But he's like, okay, let's go test it out. So he built a prototype based on that anyway. And it turned out to be the best antenna that they had ever created. And then NASA ended up like replacing all those antennas and stuff like that with that.
There you go.
So,
and they're doing similar things at Boeing too, where you get machine learning, artificial intelligence, sort of doing design work that humans can't explain.
Right.
We're getting good results, but we can't actually explain how the system came up with it. So, Soban, it's just coming up for noon here.
Yes. We have had a very. I didn't even keep track of time.
Yeah. So I've got
Dr. Mandrell for your time. Like, I honestly, you get. The conversation kind of went all over the place, but
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No. That's not.
We're going to talk about Reality Plus.
I think that I wanted to kind of. I was just so interested in so many different parts of your mind, so I definitely would like to do it maybe another time as well.
Yeah, well,
I wanted to ask if it's okay with you for me to share it on YouTube and things like that, or with friends, or okay, because I feel like there's a need for this kind of thing too for people to know about, because this is I'm trying to bring in more to this kind of stuff to people I know, just more conversations that are in depth about topics that are not necessarily mainstream, and
see, there we go. We are now scattered geographically, and you have a network of people that who are distributed, but we're linked by an interest in certain philosophical questions. And
it kind of reminds me of being like a nervous system, it's like certain neurons just
exactly. Yes, exactly. And there are all kinds of possibilities for this. One of the things that makes me hopeful for the future rather than despairing is that's got to be a positive thing. Again, it takes us beyond the university, right?
That's true.
With the pandemic, the university was shut down. We were having classes online. And now the question is, as we're coming back for class, do we really need the physical facilities? So we're going to be sorting that out over the next few years. So
right, yeah.
So let's do this again, and we'll come back to the obviously huge question of religion in the modern world.
Oh man, yeah, that's massive. That's massive, and there's so much there too. You're absolutely right. Well, thank you so much for your time, man. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We'll do this again soon.
Thank you so much. Yes, let's do it again. Okay.
Okay, great. Bye now.